So, welcome, Amy.
Thank you, Justin. It's so nice to be here with you.
Brilliant. So, Amy, for people who don't know who Amy Castoro is, tell me a little bit about yourself.
Okay. Well, I live here in Princeton, New Jersey,
Yeah.
and I have a husband and two amazing children. They're in their 20s now. Um, I am the CEO and president of a company called the Williams Group,
Mm.
and we get to wake up every day helping families be even stronger as a united force so that either their philanthropy or their relationships will keep them unified over time.
So tell me a little bit about the Williams Group. Where did the Williams Group come from, and what's its aim?
Yeah, it's a phenomenal organization, I will say myself. Started by a guy named Roy Williams.
Yeah.
And Roy Williams played in the NFL. When he came out of the NFL, he looked around at all of his peers and he saw that the wealth wasn't necessarily a positive force on their lives. But in some cases, it was actually disrupting their lives and family relationships were breaking up. And so he wanted to do something about that. And he turned to ask the audience. He did a bunch of research over 2,500 families. And what he learned was that what broke down these families wasn't what they were doing. It wasn't it wasn't estate planning. It wasn't having a really great trust and estates attorney. It was actually the relationships or the families themselves that were causing the implosion.
Right.
So we did, when in that research, we learned that there were really just three core drivers. Myself, having been kicked out of accounting, I was not real big fan on trying to focus on the wealth. I was more eager to prepare the families for the wealth. And it turns out that more than half the time when these families face some discord over money, it has to do with trust and communication. How comfortable are they to have conversations about money? The second thing we found in that research was that the next generation just wasn't prepared. It wasn't that they didn't know how to read a balance sheet, although that's the case sometimes. It was really that their relationship to wealth was challenging. They the wealth was running their lives instead of them running the wealth, if that makes sense.
Mm.
And then the third piece we found was that there was just a lack of either articulation or alignment with the family values. So not everybody had the same understanding of the purpose of the wealth.
Yeah.
And so we're now an organization of 20 coaches across the US, although I do have one that's really strong in London. Um, and what we do is we help families trust themselves to have some of the conversations they might not be trusting themselves to have just yet.
Yeah, yeah. These are really working with families or who've been entrepreneurial, I presume, and have created a significant amount of wealth to pass on. Is that really the target market?
Well, for us, it is most definitely. I would say most families that work with us are north of somewhere around 15 to 20 million.
Wow.
However, I will tell you that what we teach applies to every family, every
Yeah.
individual. It's just that I think the families with significant or greater amounts of wealth like that have more trouble.
Mm. Well, I mean, we've talked to quite a few people on the podcast over time, and there does seem to be I think you have an expression in America from shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in three generations. In the UK, I know in Yorkshire we have clogs to clogs in three generations. And of course the entrepreneur who set out to create wealth for their family, the striver, the one who kind of was at the front of the frontier, to create that in the first place. The next generation may not have the same desires or goals.
Right. Yeah. They grow up with abundance and
Mm.
they don't necessarily have the skills. Or, you know, one of our clients said it to me the best. He said, I can give my kids everything, but I can't give them desperation.
Mm.
And so, how do we teach these same values of hard work? How do we have a conversation, even just about the standards of expectations on both sides of that? What does mom and dad expect? And really, what do the children expect? There was a moment where we worked with a family, they were fairly well off. And the father said, you know, in order to work for this family business, you have to work hard. And for him, working hard meant sweeping the floors of the different construction sites. The
Wow.
son, who had just graduated the Stern School with an MBA, had said, Dad, you want to put a broom in my hand, and yet I can run the company with this phone in my hand. And so they were able to then embark on a new conversation of, what does hard work mean?
Mm.
So it was sort of fascinating to bring the two different generations and their values into an aligned understanding through that.
Yeah, yeah. And so if founders or owners of families are challenged around that, what is the process that you take them through to 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 allow this wealth transfer to become easier, I suppose?
Do you know, we do start with an assessment, because the view from the top, meaning mom and dad's perspective of the next gen, is not always the same as the next gen looking up, if you will. So there's this whole aspect that we look into about how prepared are they from their perspective, meaning both generations. We look at what's their willingness to have open and honest conversations. In other words, speak truth to power in some cases. And we look at, what is the purpose? Do they have the same interpretation? So we take them through these 50 questions. They can do it digitally. And then we just bring everybody together for a 3-hour conversation. Obviously, these days that's on Zoom. Uh,
Mm.
and what they learn from that is what does make sense for them in their next steps. Is it to start a conversation about building some more skills on how to have some of these difficult conversations? Is it just to get smarter on what the family's actually expecting with philanthropy? Do they have questions about succession? What happens if the business is sold or already has been sold? And so maybe they just need to answer a few key questions up front. More than likely, they want to add some more tools to their toolbox of how they have these conversations. You know,
Mm.
one thing I often say is, families just don't inherit wealth necessarily. They also inherit the ability to have conversations about money. And for most of us, that's not a really comfortable conversation yet. So
No.
they need a few more tools in the toolbox for that. And that's really our first meeting. From there, once we've gotten all those communications or those conversations out in the open, and really the family has developed more comfort around them, we'll then help them build a family values and mission statement. And that is actually really vital. It's really the North Star, and it outlines not just the purpose for how the family defines itself, but the roles responsible for that to happen. So
Sure.
if one of the roles might be that somebody's picked as an executor, for example, very often I interview these kids and they don't want that job. They find that job to be overwhelming, or maybe their siblings are looking at them and saying, you know, he might be my older brother, but all he ever did was cheat in Monopoly when we were growing up. So I'm not sure I can really trust him with all of this. So how do we help them have those conversations about roles and expectations?
So
And then finally, they're on
sorry,
their own.
could you give me an example of what this kind of values North Star kind of, what would a typical, I mean, there probably isn't a typical one, but maybe you got some stories about what that would sound like, you know, that someone you've worked with.
Yeah, almost always they have something in there about how the next generation is going to contribute, whether that contribution is with their time.
Mm.
Maybe the contribution is how they carry the family name forward. Maybe that contribution is in philanthropy or managing investments. But there's always a way that the next generation is really invited to participate and carry the legacy forward. There's always something in there about expectations. In other words, we will work hard for the sake of future generations. We will work hard for the sake of being able to contribute to our community in positive ways. Um, we will always, there's something in there about education and protecting the family going forward. Always something in there about purpose. Who is that next individual becoming, and how do they see themselves evolving or merging with the help of the family wealth? I'd say
Yeah.
those are the key pieces of all of them.
Yeah, I can straight away see the challenges with this type of conversation. I mean, there may be an element of feeling that who are you to lay down the rules, or how I live my life if I was going to be the inheritor of wealth. This is not my responsibility. With money becomes responsibility, doesn't it?
Yes.
And
Yeah.
that can feel constrictive, possibly. And
Right.
if there are rules attached to it as well, then
Yeah.
I can see how tensions may arise. How would you? I mean, also, I can imagine that even politically there could be divides within generations, especially. I think we're observing, aren't we? I think across the world that through the and as always through the generations there have been different perspectives,
Yeah.
and obviously I, I tend to feel, I don't have any statistics on this, but the younger generation are very much more connected to the environment and to ecology and to the future of global warming and all these issues, and of course wealth may have been created with a disregard to those things, and so I can see there's huge challenges. How do you how do you find
Yeah.
your way or feel your way through this?
I know. And it is different every time. I can remember one family we worked with. The youngest son said to me, over here, we're all very left in our beliefs. Mom and dad are very right. And
Mm,
I'm very concerned about how we're going to find the happy medium here. I would say that the secret here is really asking the question of who's setting the rules. Like, as you said, there are roles and then there are possibly strings attached to that. If the whole family, if the next generation has a really important and vital say in how those roles take shape, they have a lot more buy-in to that. To find that alignment requires that the next generation trusts that their voice is going to be heard. Because if they feel like it's more of the same, where granted the dad or the mom might have tremendous skill in running a very successful company or even being an entrepreneur, it's a different skill set to really start to share that wealth. And so when we can have, and truly you do need a facilitator, it's sort of like the shoemaker's son. It's very hard for mom and dad, given the role that they have, to really facilitate an open conversation like this. But when you can steer the conversation towards alignment versus agreement, you'll make some progress. Alignment being, if one side of the family is deeply committed to the world being a better place, and the other side of the family is deeply committed to the world being a better place, but they have different paths to get there, they can respect, actually appreciate the different paths if they trust that they share the same goal. So it's really focusing on purpose as opposed to position. And
sure.
that's a skill.
So, Amy, now not everyone has got, a lot of our listeners won't be passing on such significant wealth as the people that you're helping. So, what are for the you know for what a normal family? What are the things who don't employ someone like yourself? Um, what advice could you give them to have these conversations, or how that they can maybe do some of this work themselves?
Absolutely. And I would suggest that they have a family meeting. Do you know, many families these days with COVID-19 in everybody's mind, they are coming together for video conference calls, and they tend to be celebrating birthdays or saying hello. But there's another valuable way to use that time, but families have to declare it. So when you can say to everyone, hey, let's have a family meeting, and take some time to one-on-one check in with each one of them and say, what is important to you about who we are as a family, about how we want to keep our relationships strong, about what you'd like to see in the future, more of, or perhaps less of. So do a little bit of homework. I use the acronym HABIT here. So the first is H for homework. The second thing you want to do is really look at, if you were to have that conversation, ask each person in the family, if they were running that meeting, what would they want to accomplish? How would they want to spend their time and walk away with? So there's your A in habit. B is set up the boundaries. Ask them, what's going to create this conversation so that you feel you're being heard and that you can say anything you want? And those boundaries might be that simply people aren't interrupted. I've had families say that they don't want humor to always be where the deflection happens, that we have a pause and say, no, if somebody says something serious, it's not made a joke of. So for every family, there are different things there to make sure that they feel the boundaries are being respected. The second is involve everyone. You might have this meeting often and just have different people leading it, or ask at the end of the meeting, who wants to take this forward? I've had families say that what they'd love to do is create some sort of historical reference. Maybe they videotape everyone in the family and create a stronger sense of identity for the family. So someone could take that on as a role and let them run with it.
Yeah.
Or as my mom would say, give them their head. In other words, just let them go and try not to over manage it. And then finally, at the end of this meeting, it's super important that they tune it up. That's the T in habit. So the tune up would be, guys, this was a great conversation. What do we want to keep doing? And what do we want to do differently next time? So these are great little tips for a family to take their everyday sort of surface level conversations to the next level and work on their relationships.
Yeah.
Is that useful?
Yeah, I think that is really useful. And then kind of practically, what I mean, we all had, let's say they've had this great conversation, and I can actually imagine how difficult that may be for a lot of people, because what we're really talking about here is the death of your loved ones. You know, the passing of your parents, your grandparents, whoever. That's what we're really saying. That's not the easiest thing for anyone. We all know this is going to happen, but it's not the easiest conversation to. Hi, Mum. I want to talk about when you're dying.
Oh,
you know,
yeah.
uh, you know. So obviously, these are unspoken conversations, though, of course, because everyone's had them, and especially at the moment, you know, with vulnerable people, um, with the pandemic that we've got throughout the world, that people are feeling fragile and vulnerable, and there's an element of being scared. From both sides, aren't there? From younger people, that they may lose someone who's loved, and from the elder generation who are feeling particularly vulnerable, even just because of their age. So yeah, this is a this is a conversation you need to be brave about.
Yeah, no question about it. You know, it isn't something that everybody talks about, but it is something that everybody thinks about. It's sort of like we're walking around with those big placards on our chest that say, I'm afraid to have this conversation and I know it's important.
Yeah.
So we all sort of know it's out there. I think it's a little more challenging for the next generation than it is for the first generation, because frankly, they see, for lack of a better word, the waterfall, right? They're getting a little bit closer. So I think the way to bring the conversation up is, mom or dad, there's something that we've never talked about before, but it is something that we should probably start thinking about. And there'll be a time someday when we don't have your wisdom around. What are some of the things that you want us to keep in mind? What are some of the values that you want to make sure we pass on for the future generations? So when you can start there, it seems to make the conversation a little bit easier, and you can start at the shallow end of the pool. And then as the conversation progresses, they may actually bring up some conversations about, I'd really like for you to have the grandfather clock. And that's when you can say, well, how can we make that a public conversation?
Yeah.
Because those are the sidebars that sometimes can get families into trouble. So that would be one conversation. And then it's stunning to me how we do something called a crisis simulation with each family. And we pretend that mom and dad have gone off on vacation, and sure enough, an elephant sat on their head and they can't talk. And so we ask some tough questions like, who has power of attorney?
Yeah.
Like, what are their wishes? And have any arrangements been made? And by the way, if I needed to find the passwords, where would I look? And what's your concern about having this conversation? And is this a conversation you want to have, right? You want to ask for permission in there. So those are maybe some things they can say to get the conversation started. And of course, not everybody's going to be willing.
No.
Right. So we have to give them their head on that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And come to it when they're ready. My experience is that these conversations get started, and about 6 months later, they tend to pop back up and say, we talked about that. Maybe we should talk a little more about that.
Yeah. And when do you find people reach out to you for this help? Is it because they've already kind of got to loggerheads and are going, we need a facilitator here, or are people mature enough to go, do you know what? Even before we start this, let's get a facilitator in.
Both, and then some.
Right.
What breaks my heart are the people who call and say, I suspect my mom or dad might have Alzheimer's, or they've suddenly had a stroke and they can't talk, or something has happened where they're somehow compromised and they're no longer available to have these conversations. Those are challenging because the next generation isn't necessarily all on the same page. They haven't had the opportunity to hear from mom and dad. What are our marching orders? What is it that they want? So we really do encourage families to have these conversations before it's too late. Many of the clients who call us are in their 60s, 70s, and 80s, and they're asking these questions. They can see the runway is getting a little shorter, or their next gen has called us and said, I don't know how much longer I'll have mom and dad, and I'd love to be able to access their wisdom in a different way. I'd love to be able to make mistakes and have them help me see where I went wrong and maybe offer more guidance. So it really comes from lots of different angles, but more often than not, it's the 60s, 70s, 80-year-olds that are saying, we need to button this up.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. That's, I can see that's a very sensible thing. And it is probably going to be the older generation who have got the foresight to have this conversation and possibly the wisdom and bravery to have the conversation.
Yeah. Oh, well said. Absolutely. There was a gentleman who called us, I don't know, maybe it was 8 months ago. And he had a sense that his health wasn't really strong. He was, I'll put him at maybe mid-70s. And he was worried because he had one sibling who wasn't really very communicative with his other siblings. And it broke his heart, frankly. And so he called to see, boy, is there a way you can help us weave the family back together? And I said, honestly, I'm not sure. Let's check out with this assessment and see where we are. Well, sure enough, by the time we had finished the assessment, the dad had gone into hospice.
Right.
And so we started the process anyway, and he rallied and actually was able to come to the meeting for the last hour. And what he saw in that last meeting and what the children saw in that last meeting was a sudden real awakening to this fragility of life. And they let the past be the past. The siblings were able to embrace in a hug, and the dad suddenly felt at peace. Believe it or not, I called about, I don't know, maybe a month later to find out that the dad was watering his plants in the front yard. And I said, so what's happening over there? And he said, honestly, it's much more pleasant to be around everyone. So I feel like I'll stick around a bit longer. And I just
Yeah.
loved that, because it wasn't as hard as everybody thought it was going to be. It's just taking that first step,
Wow.
get the conversation started.
Great. Great.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for joining me today, Amy. It's been absolutely fascinating chatting to you and the great work that you do. How can our listeners find out more about yourself and the Williams Group?
Yeah, please. I put out these funny little homemade videos every once in a while on our blog. So come to thewilliamsgroup.org and you can learn more about our content and information. Truly, it applies to everyone out there. Thank you, Justin. This has just been magnificent to have this kind of opportunity to tell families, get to work over there. These are important conversations.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well,
Yeah.
thank you very much for your time, Amy. It's been lovely to meet you and lovely to chat to you. Thank you once
Same.
again. Bye bye.
All right. Stay safe.
So until next time, this is Justin King helping you feel more informed in your retirement.